You're listening to My Millennial Property. I'm Glen James and this is
John Pigeon.
And we've got a guest today, Corey Shackleton. Hey Corey, how are you?
Good, Glen. How are you?
Welcome, Corey.
Oh,
hey, John.
I'm pretty good. Before we get into this juicy topic, I want to give Sean Wellman from Wellman Finance a little bit of a shout out for getting behind My Millennial Property.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess for me personally, using a mortgage broker, I'm outsourcing all the research and all the work.
You like doing that in your life, don't you, really?
Well, yeah, I do. Yeah, so every area of my life I like to outsource, including looking for a mortgage. So the reason why I use a mortgage broker is because they're doing mortgages day in, day out. I might only be touching a mortgage every 2 years, every 3 years. So I don't know what's going on. So this is why you need a broker that you can build a good relationship with for the long term.
Yeah, especially when there's over 80 lenders out there at the moment.
Over 80 lenders and so many products. Like if each lender had 2 products only, that's a lot to compare across the marketplace.
160.
Yeah. So there's so many options, and that's why you need a quality broker who's in your corner, who actually knows what the flip's going on.
Yes.
And Sean Wellman, we're talking about you, buddy.
Yep. The big dog.
So we've got Shaq with us today, and can I call you a fire professional?
Sure.
You
can.
So give us a little bit of a rundown on what you've been doing the last, I guess, 10 years even, and what you're doing now, and yeah.
Sure. Yeah, well, I guess probably for the last 15 years I've been working in the bushfire space with the Rural Fire Service, so working out of their state headquarters down in Sydney. And the last probably 6 years I've been the Director of Community Resilience, which is really looking after everything that's done by the organisation pre and post fire. So it's about preparing communities, preparing the landscape for bushfires, and then once we see those fires occur, it's about understanding what's happened and then helping transition into recovery for those people in those communities that have been affected. So it's a pretty big portfolio in that regard, because a lot of what the RFS does is fighting fires, but a big part of what it does is educating communities, preparing them, making sure they understand the risk, and making sure that we also have communities that are not just understanding the risk, but are also built and placed in locations that are suitable from a design and construction point of view as well. So it's quite a complex space, but I think it's a really valuable one when we talk about trying to create resilience in our communities, that we have people that are built appropriately and understand risk.
Because realistically, it can happen at any time, can't it? Unless it's raining nonstop for 3 weeks. I mean, if there's been a dry patch and there's a bit of scrub around, is that a fair statement to say that it could go at any time?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen it, particularly in the last fire season, that even when you get, patches of rain, there's been so much, long periods of drought, prolonged periods, that kind of small patches of rain doesn't make much of a difference. And all of a sudden you get those right conditions where it's a bit dry and a bit windy, and a fire kicks off, and all of a sudden it's got something banging on your doorstep. So
I grew up in a very barren, no trees, flat environment where bushfire was never an issue, unless a stubble caught on fire and you'd put it out. Now living in an area where there's lots of trees, lots of bushland, obviously the summer that we've just been through and the catastrophic events that have occurred in multiple states, it seemed to be the perfect storm. What was the build-up that made that so big?
Yeah, right. It was, I guess, a perfect storm. What we had was, prolonged periods of drought, which really fed into, I guess, windows and periods of pretty extreme weather. And what comes with that is a whole range of challenges, from not just the dryness of the fuels, but availability of water, and then when you add that weather with the wind, and then the hot temperatures, it really starts to create those issues. And then we saw what unfolded, that unprecedented season where we had fires started in Queensland and essentially burnt the whole east coast of Australia in terms of their patch where they were burning. And I think it was well over 17 million hectares of bush that was burnt.
It's amazing,
there was,
isn't it?
2,500 homes almost in New South Wales burnt down, over 3,000 across the country. So that's not including sheds and outbuildings and other things, that come with that. So it's a massive, massive impact. Huge.
So we're a property podcast. We can talk about bushfires and droughts and everything else, but I suppose why we got you on here today was in the last few weeks there's been people messaging us saying, oh, can we pick up some cheap land in these bushfire affected areas. I did a clarity call with a person last week who'd lost their home, unfortunately, in the fires, and had a payout, and said, well, what do I do with my money? Do I move out of that area? What's the impact of a bushfire affected area from a zoning point of view? How does that change their lives in terms of trying to rebuild and the impact and the implications?
Yeah, there's probably a few parts of that. I think in the black and white sense, from a zoning point of view, it won't change the zoning or affect anything in that regard per se, but what it will do is force the hand of someone rebuilding to consider bushfire, because people would have probably built pre-bushfire requirements. The bushfire legislation came in quite strongly in 2001, 2002, and anyone that builds now in a bushfire prone area has got some pretty strict guidelines they've got to comply with and some Australian standards. So now that they've gone through this case and they've got to rebuild, they'll have to consider those requirements, and that does add considerable cost, potentially, to that rebuild space. So that alone is a big piece.
And that's a risk with insuring your current place if you are in one of those zones, because you might be insured, your house might be insured for 500 grand. If there was a total loss and a claim was paid, it might not cost 500 grand to rebuild. It might cost 550 or 600. So I know you're not a financial or an insurance expert, but do you think people need, if they are living in a bushfire zone, need to talk to their insurance company and say, hey, what does your company provide in terms of, can I increase my sum insured an extra 20% or whatever that is, just in case?
Yeah, definitely. We've seen some big fires in 2013 in the Blue Mountains in Springwood. There was 200 plus houses lost there, and a big issue arose with people being underinsured in that scenario, where they'd get their payout, and you're spot on, Glenn, they'd get their 500,000 or whatever the amount was, and they look at the rebuild cost in a like-for-like scenario, and they were 15-20% underinsured. So it's definitely a discussion that should be had.
Right. So would these 2,500 homes, for example, that are lost, would they know straight away now what their requirements are to build? Like, has the change been made immediately because of what's happened with that from an RFS perspective?
Yeah, it's a site-by-site assessment that goes on. So someone might live in one part of a suburb and might back onto the bush, and someone might live a street away. It's similar piece of bush, but as you can imagine, there's a different risk there because they're further away. So what happens is, and the RFS will go through this process, is each homeowner will get an assessment of what's called their bushfire attack level or their BAL level is for their property, and that will then determine how they rebuild. Yep. So there's a series of classes that sit within that, ranging from what's called the flame zone, which is right up against the bush, and then it steps away as you get further away from the bush. So they'll start to have those assessments done. The RFS will start to give that information out to the community.
Is that, I know that's very specific to New South Wales. It would be similar in other parts of the country as well, ish?
Yeah, so the way it sits is the National Construction Code, which applies across the country, has a standard that sits for bushfire, and all states are subscribed to complying with that standard. In New South Wales, it's more stringent in the sense that we have another document that's enshrined in New South Wales legislation called Planning for Bushfire Protection, and that also covers not just the construction of the buildings, but your landscaping, your access, your water, and all your separation as well. So it's a holistic.
That's unlike New South Wales to have more red tape than the rest of the planet.
Don't be like that.
So you mentioned BAL ratings or looking at essentially where the bushfire rating or zone is around us, and I've seen numerous occurrences over time where there's some cheap land that hasn't been built on before, and it's $40,000, for example, under what everything else is. But when they put plans into council, they realise, oh, hang on a minute, there's a BAL rating that's too high. Talk to us briefly about how that affects things.
Yeah, so I guess that there's two parts from a development point of view. If someone wants to come along and build a house, now they get their BAL rating, and it falls out as one of the 6 classes, I guess, of a BAL rating. The higher you get, the higher the cost. So if you're in that upper end and you're in that flame zone category, which is the worst case scenario, then you might be talking 15 to 25% on top of the cost of your house to put in those extra requirements to build. So that's a big cost you've got to factor in. If you're going to do something a bit more kind of development savvy, like a dual occupancy or a small subdivision, then there's another level of requirements that come in where, I guess the approach from a policy perspective is we don't want to add more people in high-risk areas. So you've got to then get to a different threshold in your barrel rating. So you can't just build wherever you like. You've got to have enough separation from the bush to meet the threshold. So then you have these separation requirements which start to come into play. And you might think you could go and do a dual occupancy or a subdivision, but once you start to put these setbacks in from your bush, all of a sudden the lot can't support that. And that's where people get caught out.
Yeah.
Practically speaking, what are the key things that you would need in your brand new property if you're in a bushfire zone as opposed to a non-bushfire zone? Like, is it every property has to have a tank underwater just for bushfire? Is it different? You can't build a timber fence between the properties? Like,
there's a range of things, and I mentioned before about this broader spectrum in New South Wales where it covers landscaping and access and water and those things. The general rule of thumb, if you're in a bushfire-prone area, generally there's a minimum you've got to have ember protection. So you've got to look at what screens are on your windows, how you seal your house up. It's all about just stopping embers from getting in and around your house. So that's normally the minimum. Like you look at things like gutter guards and those kind of ember protection, and that's is in the order of somewhere between $2,000 to $5,000. You can probably whack on top of a standard house, and you're pretty much there. It's not too hard.
Wow.
And then what goes with that is an assessment of, depending on where your site is, do you need to have more thought put into your access? Do you have to provide a tank? Do you need to provide a dedicated fire hose or those kind of things? They start to come into play depending on where your property is. If it's in a suburban block, you probably got nothing else other to worry about than just your building. If you're in a rural place where you've got long access roads and you're a bit isolated, then some other factors start to come into play.
Yeah, so similar to a flood zone, I suppose. You've got to adapt according. Your house might have to go a bit higher. In the example of a fire zone, you just need to obviously take into account the protection you need to put in to make sure it's safe. The barrel rating is a massive one though, isn't it? Like when you're talking 20% extra build cost, like that's a big chunk of money.
Yeah, it is. And most of that goes around things like windows, glazing, shutters, a lot of those kind of considerations really at cost.
And I guess sprinklers in the roof, would that be if you're really on the extreme living up on a property and you're at the top of a ridge and stuff like that?
Yeah, the way it works is things like sprinklers, and we hear a lot about bunkers and those type of things. They're all add-ons that go as part of the package, but it doesn't offset your requirements. So if you've got to build a house that's that top rating, that's flame zone as they call it, you can put a sprinkler system on top of that, and that doesn't offset any of the other construction. It's just an additional measure you'd be doing because you're concerned about fire.
Right.
How much does the politics come into play with all this? Because if there's a housing shortage and the government generating income from new housing and it improves the economy and all those sort of things, like how much of a say do they have in the whole scheme of things to say, well, we'll let this subdivision fly because we need more houses?
I always found, like when I was with RFS at their level, particularly big urban release areas and those big land releases that roll through and rezonings, we were always fairly independent in that. We'd always provide our advice, and it'd play out as it had to play out. I think generally the biggest issues and the biggest challenges we see in what we've been talking about with rebuilds and that is in areas where it's probably reached its capacity. Like a lot of the areas through the Blue Mountains, there's not a lot of land getting released there because of all the ridge tops are built out. And they're the worst places to build. So most of the new land releases are in areas where we can probably manage the risk, and as part of that land release, we make sure that we've got perimeter roads around the outside of the subdivision and we've got good separation so that people don't come up against these flame zone requirements and this extra cost at the build stage. So from a land use perspective, we try and get it right up front now. And it's more the legacy stuff that was done earlier.
Yeah, so on legacy stuff, if you've purchased an old shack in a fire zone, a crazy one, have there been any local governments or state governments that you're aware of that have said, all right, everyone, you've got within the next 5 years, you have to do all the window fittings or something like that? Are governments... Like, at what point do you have to get some legacy properties to spec without, telling people they need to do it now, but within a time period?
Yeah, no one. There's no local governments I'm aware of that have gone down the path of trying to make people do it. It's generally the case of people get caught when they have an existing house, they want to do alts and adds, they come on to put some extensions, it triggers a DA, and then there'll be some requirements to say, hey, you want to put an extra bedroom in, while you're at it, you need to upgrade your windows and fix the external facade.
Oh, so we won't allow the extension unless the whole thing comes up to spec. So they get them at that point.
And it's a real fine one. And even, you know, the challenge is always, you probably can't ask someone to pull their roof off and reclad their whole house, but there'll be an effort to try and make the existing structure a bit more resilient. Otherwise, you're going to have this non-combustible, you know, external piece that's been tacked on against a timber house. The timber house is going to burn down anyway. So it's trying to find that balance. So often that's when people will start to get brought into that discussion. But there's been no councils I'm aware of that have tried to enforce that requirement.
Okay. So if I'm sitting in a bushfire zone that's just been affected, my house survived, I'm living life as normal, my house is fine, I won't be affected by this at the moment unless I want to go and do something extra to my home. Other than maybe my insurance policy might go up. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, putting all the emotional side of it to the side, I mean, I don't think there'd be any impact where someone would be coming along and saying, you've got to now fix something or do something different. Again, the insurance piece is probably, I guess, an unknown and something people would want to look out for, but they're definitely, if you've made it through and you haven't lost your house, I can't imagine there'd be anyone coming and making you do things.
Yeah, okay. So, and this is a personal opinion, but if you looked at say a town that was totally ravished by bushfire and there was only maybe 500 people living there to begin with, what do you think the future of a town like that looks like now, given what you've just told us around building costs and things like that?
I think it looks very different. We look back to, there were some fires that went through Tathra down near Bega, 2018. They lost about 60 to 70 homes there. So it was very, very typical of a lot of those South Coast areas that we've seen, but that's happened on a multiple scale now. And there's probably still only about 40% of those homes that have rebuilt, and that's 3 years on. So it does take a while for these communities to rebuild, and a lot of people just might get their insurance pad and just say, I just can't go through the process of doing this. I just emotionally, I've lost everything. I don't want to try this again. I want to go elsewhere. So I think it's fair to say the community will probably look and feel a hell of a lot different, as time goes on. And you'd hope from a physical point of view they'll get built back a lot better than what they were previously. But I think it'll be a different looking community.
Because, I mean, a lot of these towns were built 80, 100 years ago, and a lot of them are one way in, one way out communities. I'm sure now we're a bit more broader in our thinking that they would no longer be built that way again.
Yeah, and just on that, like a government's being a little bit more strategic with like main roads and like clearing 20 metres from the curb as opposed to 10 or something like that.
I think there's a clear delineation between when we talk about what we're going to do in a new subdivision or a new land release. Absolutely, we're very smart in how we deal with access. Have we got multiple ways in, multiple ways out, perimeter roads, wide road reserves for clearing. But if you look at any of those coastal communities down on the south coast, it's very hard retrospectively to come along when they've got a road that punches through a national park for 15 kilometres to put in some clearing. And even if you did, it probably makes no difference anyway, because you've got to travel 15 k's through the bush and a couple of extra trees, and what does it matter? They're still going to fall over the road and block access and cause all sorts of dramas. So it's a really hard retrospective thing to address.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's like it did disturb me. Like, I know a lot of people did lose their homes, and I was actually thinking about the other day, I'm like, I don't know what that feeling would be like to actually lose your refuge, your safest place, kind of emotionally and whatever, and all your stuff, and to be displaced. That's horrendous. But if you are living in a zone that is not insurable, like, what do you do? I mean, for me personally, if I can't afford to insure my own house, I can't afford a house. Now, are the bank, and just probably more a question for John, like, I would imagine you'd think the banks lending to those regions should have to have something in the loan document that every 12 months you need to submit your certificate of currency. Well, because it's their asset as well if they're using it as security. Yeah,
I think generally it's reasonably loose on the sense that when you buy a property, you've got to show a certificate of currency, but from then on, it's really up to you.
Well, you could cancel it the day after you settle.
Yeah, that's right. And the same with a car.
Yeah.
So there's really probably no requirement on that. But yeah, it is unfortunate if the conditions change. And a lot of suburbs and homes in Brisbane would have been the same when the man-made flood came through
Yeah.
in 2011. Like, we had no... They never thought that was going to happen to their area, so their insurance policies and the values on their home have severely changed, haven't they?
Like, I wonder, like, if you were going to build or buy in a high-risk fire area, I would imagine if you can't get building insurance, you've got to rethink your living arrangements. Like, unless you've got that much wealth, you can self-insure.
Yeah, I think even in a lot of those sort of remote areas that are prone to storms and floods and all that, you can still get insurance. It just costs a lot more than the average Joe. So it's just it's a factor that's just got to be catered for, doesn't it? Like, I don't think it's a game changer personally, but I suppose what we're saying is, for those that think they're going to get some cheap property out of this, it might not be the wisest decision to go into one of those areas and think, oh yeah, I'll pick up this land cheaply and I'll flog it off in a couple of years and make thousands. Probably not going to happen.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're going to find any super great bargains. I think there's a bit more to it than it's not a fire sale.
Yeah,
pardon the pun, but yeah, I think there's a bit more to it than that for sure.
So what are you? So you've left the RFS. So what are you doing now? You're consulting.
Yeah, so I work for a company called Black Ash Bushfire Consulting, and what we do there is a whole range of things, really. From you do a lot of work with land managers and government agencies, helping understand their bushfire risk and doing fire management planning, and looking at issues of fire trails and how we manage fire in the landscape, right through to helping people that want to build a house and they want to understand their bushfire attack level, or they want to work through the challenges of getting a small subdivision through. I guess there's a couple of interesting pieces that move. There's the understanding the landscape and fire behaviour and what that's going to mean for your site, but then there's understanding how that overlays into the legislative framework and how we navigate through those approvals that you require. So we kind of help people in that path.
So if I've got a property and it's semi-rural in a bushfire area, and I don't have a bushfire survival plan, what are the kind of 3 or 4 steps that I need to do in my bushfire survival plan?
I think probably the most important things probably initially aren't the physical things. Like it's just understanding what are you going to do, and I think that's where most people come unstuck. And we see it. I mean, even when we talk to communities after fires, they'll live in an area like the Blue Mountains and know that fire is a risk, but they just don't personalise it and feel as though it will happen to them. So I think it's coming to terms, with your household, with your family, to understand, well, what does fire mean to us and what are we going to do? Does that mean that when it's a catastrophic day or an extreme day, we're going to leave and just not be there?
Yeah.
We're going to take the pets with us and go to Auntie Mary's house? Or does it mean we're going to stay? And if we are going to stay, understanding emotionally and physically what that's going to be like. It's going to be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's going to be pitch black. It's going to be loud. It's going to be scary. And that's when most people come awry, because they think they're going to stay and defend and they feel as though they're prepared.
Yeah.
All of a sudden it goes pretty ordinary and they decide they want to get out. And that's when they get stuck on the roads.
The worst time to get out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the Victoria where 173 people died. A majority of those were caught on roads because they left late and they got stuck. So
do you think it's worth staying?
I think it can be if you're well prepared. If you know what to expect, you've got your property in good shape. And we see it now in every fire that goes through and impacts communities. There's a bunch of research that's done on why houses survived and why they didn't. And what we often see is that at the end of the day, the houses, particularly the ones that are built to a fairly decent standard, as long as they're well maintained, if somebody's there and they know how to get around with a hose once the fire front's gone and put out some embers and stop those small fires that start, they're in pretty good shape. But the caveat to that is you've got to be really well prepared and you've got to understand what it's going to be like.
Yeah, it's surprising to hear you say that, because I just think logically I'd get the hell out of there.
And I think should be the general advice. I mean, at the end of the day, when you want to manage risk, you just avoid it. So as long as you know that, the triggers there's smoke in the air and, it's the night before and I look at the forecast tomorrow, I'm not going to be there. Or it's one of those catastrophic days, hey, let's get the kids and let's just get out. That's the safest.
And would that be where we decide that if it is coming to fire season, we obviously make sure our property's well kept. We make sure that any safe stuff is either there's a safe in the ground somewhere or something like that. And then we say we're actually going to leave as soon as the local advice is to leave or stay. Like, is there always a clear
It can
recommendation?
be. Not always. Like,
That's weird, isn't it?
And there can be areas like, if you look, again, we picked the Blue Mountains because they're the obvious one. You've got areas like Mount Irvine, Mount Wilson, Mount Tomah. They've got, 15, 20, 30 Ks of, one road in, one road out. If all of a sudden a fire starts and it pops up on the RFS app and says there's a fire near you, it might be far too late to be trying to get on the roads and leave. So it really depends, and that's where you've really got to understand it. And your local brigade, from an RFS perspective, you can go and have the chats. They always, love the opportunity to talk.
Would they ever go to site?
They can. Yeah, they often will. Even things like Christmas time, you'll see Santa go around in a fire truck. Ask the question when they're around, or what do we best do here? So I think you've got to understand. Like if you live on the Central Coast and you live in right at the end of Wyong Creek or in Dooralong, it's probably a different approach to if you're back onto somewhere in Tumby or in Glenning Valley. So you've got to know your risks to make your decision.
So you transitioned out of RFS in the last 6 months or so.
Yeah.
How has that transition been, given that it's probably the busiest time for firefighters in the last 85 years?
Yeah, it was an interesting one. I had the discussion about moving on just before we kind of basically had the discussion with Shane, who's the commissioner, and he said, listen, let's just get through tomorrow. It's going to be a bad day, and then we'll make some announcements. And then that day it kind of all kicked off and started this kind of cascade of fires. So we kind of didn't speak about it again, and it got to a couple of weeks out and we decided maybe we should just hold fire, and I agreed I'd hang around. So in the end, instead of finishing before Christmas, I finished about 4 or 5 weeks ago. They convinced me just to stay through the fire season and help out, which was great. But it has been challenging because, like I said, all the stuff in my portfolio was that pre and post fire. So I feel like it's all kind of the stuff that I should be dealing with. But at the same time, I've still got some really good relationships with the RFS, and I'm always willing to help them out. And they've got a myriad of great people anyway. But
so unfortunate for the situation, but has it been beneficial to your business?
I think so. I think the fire industry in itself is, at the moment it's in a whole different space. There's a Royal Commission, there's a state inquiry, there's all sorts of stuff going on. So for us, there is a lot of interest, and there's a lot of particularly government agencies and big land managers that are starting to say, we either dodged a bullet, we better get some help, or something did hit us, and what do we do now?
Made people more aware.
Yeah, so I think there's far more interest in the space. People are far more attuned to it.
Yeah. He's a pretty modest guy, Shaq. He was only one under the big dog commissioner at the RFS.
I don't think we'd say that.
When the commissioner's at the front and the camera, Shaq's just sitting behind him.
Hide.
So back to the personal survival plan. So we've talked about the non-physical. We agree that we are going to stay or go. Like, as part of the plan, is it, like, what else do we consider?
I think that if it's in the physical sense, the basic stuff is the stuff you probably would generally think of good maintenance. You've got a good, well-maintained lawn, maybe some landscaping things. You don't want to have shrubs and combustible mulch in and around your house and under your windows, because, we've seen in the last fires, houses getting lost a kilometre away from bush. So those embers will spot in, they'll land in a garden bed, they'll get up against some mulch, and they'll start a fire, and then the heat from the fire cracks a window, embers get in, and your house burns down.
Wow.
So that kind of immediate area around your property, if you've got a metre or two that's really well maintained, almost like a path or some non-combustible mulching around your house, and then just a good mowed lawn around that, you're in pretty good shape.
And gutters, obviously.
Yeah, clean your gutters. If you think of your typical well-maintained
you should be doing anyway, right?
home and garden front page kind of thing, that's the ideal thing. You don't necessarily, it's not all about having shutters and sprinkler systems and bunkers. They're all fantastic, but the average punter isn't going to go and spend 10, 15 grand on a sprinkler system and then another 20 grand on a bunker. But you can go out and mow your lawns and clean your gutters out.
Yeah. And if someone has property in a fire zone, at that end of the spectrum, the government requirement might be to have a dedicated fire tank.
Could be.
Yeah.
If you're not on reticulated water supply, or if you're in an area where it's unreliable, we will start to look at those options of having some dedicated water for firefighting. So if brigades do turn up, and again, that's never something you can bank on, but if they do, there's water there, or if you want to stay yourself, you've got something you can fight the fire with.
Yeah, wow. And would that include like diesel generators for pumps and all that, or whatever?
Yeah, it does. It'd be a suitable kind of 5 horsepower diesel pump, potentially with a hose, and also the right fittings on the tank so that the fire services can connect into it and use the water.
Yeah, wow.
So just on that, like, people are more and more aware of building eco-friendly better for the environment, saving natural sources. From a home point of view, is that better for a bushfire to come through and protect it or not?
Better to have built that way?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think people that build like smart passive houses can do it in a way that is also very bushfire conscious. Generally that you think of a passive house, they're generally they want to maintain that internal temperature, so they're very well sealed. A lot of the features of a good passive house is also very compatible with what you want from a bushfire perspective.
Yeah.
Things like necessarily if you're in the high in flame zone, having external timber isn't going to be compatible, but you can still have some, you think about that additional upfront cost to build a good passive house with bushfire measures over the life of that development over 50 years. The overall savings you make probably turn out that it's actually a cheaper investment than just going and grabbing, your off-the-shelf product and sitting it on the ground and trying to retrofit it. So the passive house designs do have some very good features from a bushfire perspective, as long as you get the right person and you design it right.
Cool.
Yeah, fascinating.
Good stuff.
Would there be anything else, like you've got a microphone now, that you think people should be aware about or know about pre, post, during fire to do with their property that we haven't touched on?
I think it's just, and I think people will be better at this now, but just realising that it can happen to you, and just have some thought around it and have the discussion, sit around the dinner table one night with the family and say, hey, what will we do when that moment comes and it's catastrophic tomorrow? Do we want to get out or we not want to? Have the discussion, and then I think like the things we talked about, just be diligent about it, just keep your place maintained, and that's one less thing you got to worry about. But we've all got a million things to do in our day, but I think that would be beneficial.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And just the last one, and I don't expect you to be a subject matter expert, but we heard on, the news that local governments weren't allowing, backburning and all that stuff, or fire hazard reduction burning, whatever they call it. Was that just from, I guess, anecdotally, was that just all hype and wanting to blame the green agenda, or was there actual RFS, I guess, brigades that weren't allowed to do reduction burning?
It's actually a really complex one.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think it's interesting how short-term people's memories can be. I mean, we go back not even 12 months, and there was all the hysteria and anger around hazard reduction burning and the smoke impacts on air quality in Sydney. And the amount of hazard reduction burns that, basically we didn't go ahead with because of, every time there's a burn that's planned, we do a series of prediction modelling to determine where the fire's going to burn, how quickly, what's the right time to light, and what's the projected smoke that's going to come out of it, and where is it going to go, where is it going to drift, and what's it going to impact. Now, if we started seeing those impacts, particularly over the Sydney Basin, where all the smoke tends to drain because it's a basin, then we'd start to cancel burns because of that pressure around public health. So I think in that regard, it's not really so much local government that cause those issues. It's just part of the planning phase, and there's so many competing interests now around. It's not 40 years ago where you just go and light up and and you do your burning. Now there's so many other things that come into play. So quite a complex space, and I think there is, like everything, there seems to be a bit of a pendulum as it swings one way, and it probably started to go the way of less and less burning. Maybe now it might start to swing back a little bit given what's just happened, but it's not the answer either. Like, hazard reduction burning isn't the panacea to the problem. It's part of it.
Yeah, right.
And it's a good land management tool for a whole range of reasons, ecologically and also from a risk point of view, but it's not the answer. We could go and burn another twice what we burnt, and it wouldn't significantly make the problem heaps better.
Because a lot of bush burned, but there's still a lot of bloody bush that didn't burn as well.
Yeah, and even under the conditions that we saw, there was also burns that we'd put through. And because when you do the hazard reduction type burns, they're fairly low intensity. It leaves a lot of the canopy, and it leaves a lot of fuel potentially still around.
Still there.
So we had fires that had hit into those areas that had been burned, and it just moved straight through them because of the intensity of these fires we saw under the conditions.
Right.
So it's not the answer.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, that's been very, very fascinating. Yeah. So Commissioner Shack.
No, a long way.
To IC.
Yeah.
Thank you, Corey.
No worries. Thank you, John.
Thanks for coming on.
Valuable info.
All right. Cool. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, actually, is there a resource that people can go to?
Yes. Yep. The RFS website has a fair bit of stuff. There's a section on the website, I think it's called Plan and Prepare.
Yeah.
And if you go in there, if you want to look at how you might assess your site, there's what's called a single dwelling kit. And you can grab that out and it tells you how to do a real rough assessment of your property to determine what that BAL could be.
And then
site.
most state-based fire websites
agencies
would have that.
It's very similar. Yeah. Any of you, if you're in Victoria, you go to the CFA, same thing, South Australia, the CFS, they'd all have a similar product where you could unpack that and get a bit of an idea. Ultimately, when you want to make that leap and go right into it, I'd be engaging someone that's probably more down that expert path though.
Interesting. Love it. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.